So thanks guys, thanks a lot for joining us today. So this is a sort of a new idea that we came up with at READance. So far we've had like a couple of cycles where we've actually been reading books. So basically these cycles have lasted like a whole 6 weeks, and we read a couple of chapters of the book every week and meet essentially at the same time every Tuesday. We just completed reading a couple of books last Tuesday, and we thought, why not do also these one-off sessions that will allow us to, also get to some of these articles, research papers, essays, and things like that. So this is the first of it, first of the one-offs that we're doing. Very happy to have all of you join us. Normally our sessions, if you're joining us for the first time, we're completely informal. There's no real formal structure to it, but we've been starting off with a very brief summary that one of the readers or participants usually offers, which we found, at least in the recent past, really helps with, even for those of us who've read it, made our notes, to kind of just hear it from another person's perspective, right? Hear it being summarized from someone else's perspective always helps. And of course, in case you haven't managed the time to read it very thoroughly, then it's also very helpful, sort of giving you a little bit more details and insight into the article. So Lakshmi, who's of course part of the team of READance, some of you of course already met her before, will be doing the summary for us today. So we'll start with the summary, and then the floor is open for all of us. Okay. Lakshmi, over to you. Yeah, we can see your screen, Lakshmi.
So this text, so this week we were looking at a paper by Anandi S, and we're looking at a text written by a woman from this community, Muflu Rama Amritam. Is that this work in the 1930s. A few things that stood out to me here was discussion on the economic independence of the Devadasis, which she argued actually benefited the men of the upper class, upper caste landed households that held land. The Devadasis were not free to liaise with anyone of their choice. Their patrons were primarily men from Brahmin or non-Brahmin upper caste families, and the relationship between the men within the Chinnamelam and the Pediyamelam traditions itself was strictly prohibited. She also argues that the incentive for the Devadasi tradition here was purely economic. Upper caste Devadasis wanted to preserve the system for the financial gain that it offered them. And in order for them to retain the income that they derived from the land that the temples offered, they needed a daughter to carry on the tradition, and so they were incentivized to adopt girls. And this also meant that they continued to perpetuate the system with very little agency to actually break free. They also have a discussion of some of the social and competitive pressures that both men of the Devadasi community faced. They were secondary, their role within these households was secondary to that of the woman itself, were the primary bread owners, and this led to some friction. And also between among the upper caste, the women of the upper caste communities who patronized the system. So within the Devadasi debate itself, Section 2 analyzes the prevailing attitudes and the tones that different factions within this community expressed. So the first one was the conservative voices within the parliament, and this is spearheaded by Satyamurthy. They wanted to suppress the Devadasi debate. They were against the abolishment, and this was for the primary reason that it went against ancient cultures and traditions as they perceived it. So he argues that the system is equal to Christian traditions of nuns, and he's also preoccupied that the abolishment of the Devadasi system might make activists or non-Brahmins demand the deposition of Brahmin Ashtakaza priests within the temple itself. Um, he also wanted to delay the passing of the bill as long as possible. And this is met with opposition from some Devadasi factions itself, such as the Devadasis from Mayuram, who condemned this approach, saying he cared more about the priests' positions and their interests over the well-being of the Devadasis itself. So the argument here is that the Devadasi was a trope or a signifier of this particular indigenous culture or tradition that they were seeking to preserve. Muthulakshmi Reddy and the other progressive voices within the Congress, on the other hand, drew on their own. For instance, Muthulakshmi Reddy, she drew on her own experience as a medical professional who treated women from this community, and she dismisses their voices. And she puts forward her argument based on these experiences, but on the same lines dismisses the argument, the voices or the capacity of the Devadasis themselves for self-representation. For instance, she argues that those who opposed her bill didn't deserve to be heard. She condemns them as prostitutes who didn't know what was best for them. And they're characterized in a way as the opposite of an ideal Hindu womanhood as perceived. And here the emphasis is, she repeatedly says, is them being legal and chaste wives, loving mothers, useful citizens. So this appears to almost portray a particular patriarchal version of womanhood. And she argues that the Devadasis should be compulsorily married, and the men in this community should be encouraged to go ahead with these marriages, incentivized by jobs. So the Devadasis become an object of reform, to be transformed in a way that matched the reformers' vision of social progress or society. And other leaders appear to take a similar tone. For me, this was quite interesting, as it brought out questions of how we reconcile these views with views of Reddy's own life and career. She was a doctor. She was also the first female legislator in the Madras Parliament. So this brought up for me questions of her own marriage with her husband, which appears to have been fairly equitable, and she had quite a public career outside of the home. So what is the language that she uses here, and why? The third group saw Devadasis, the communities of the castes from which Devadasi women were commonly brought from. And so these communities, the Sevelalad and Senguda communities, were disassociated themselves from this practice. They saw this as a dishonor, as an impediment to their own upward mobility. And so these motivations seem to be more pragmatic, more self-interested. They perceived that this association with the Devadasi might spoil the name of their caste, and they chose to erase such connections. For instance, the South Indian Sengudar Mahana Sangam also took, for instance, was one of the castes that came forward to deny such associations. So here their picture, again, is not of the Devadasis themselves, but it's more motivated by more self-interested, pragmatic considerations. So Mogalu Ramamritam here she was initiated into the Devadasi tradition at a very young age. She didn't have any immediate ancestors, but her extended family convinced her father to dedicate her based on the financial prospects it offers. She breaks away and marries a man of her choice, a music teacher, and this meant that she was ostracized by her community. She later meets Gandhi and becomes an activist campaigning for the non-corporation movement. She later also joins the self-respect movement by Periyar, and she campaigns against women oppression in many forms. And her novel, written at this point, was when very few women could actually write a full-length novel and get it published. Most of these writings took a certain approach or a certain stereotype approach to thinking about women and were placed within the context of traditional virtues such as chastity, obedience to husbands, or the home as their legitimate place. So her novel in many ways breaks away. It's a full-length novel the publication of the novel itself faced a lot of resistance, but she did eventually manage to get it published. Its distinction lies in that it's both semi-autobiographical in nature. It projects her own political views and her ideas of what the ideal outcome or vision for perhaps the Devadasi movement should have been like. And she also contextualizes this interest within the Devadasis within a rich socio-political context. So unlike the previous debates that either treated the Devadasi women as objects that needed reform, or amongst more pragmatic considerations or self-interest, she explores many of the richly contextualized differences and of women within this community and perhaps their motivations. So here, for instance, is Boga Chandamani, who she's one, which means one who enjoys wealth, and she introduces her two daughters to this profession to accumulate wealth. And speaks per motivation here. The Zamindar's son loses all his wealth to a Devadasi and he gets reformed by another Devadasi who actually manages to break away from the system. Another Zamindar's son leaves his wife and begins to live with the Dasis. He's disinherited by his father as a result. The Devadasi who are concerned primarily with the accumulation of wealth then no longer are interested in him, and they move to Jnanasundari, his wife, who's disguised as a wealthy Zamindar. She now learns about the realities of life in the Devadasi household, and this offers a rich account of perhaps what that may have been like. Poga Chandamani, unable to find another wealthy patron, throws out her own son and daughter-in-law, and they sell their daughter into the Devadasi system, and she has a life mirroring Ramamritam herself. So the story ends with a conference where these different groups get together, representing multiple voices and perspectives of the Devadasis, and then they demand for the abolishment of the Zamindari or Devadasi system. And she argues that the distinction lies in the fact that this manages to capture voices rather uniquely for this time period that largely otherwise essentialized or redealt with dealt with them as certain characters rather than depreciate the complexity of the roles that they played. That's book summary here.
Thank you so much for that, Lakshmi. Thank you. Floor is essentially open for thoughts, comments, ideas that you want to share. So please feel free. So maybe I will just sort of start it off, particularly because the two books that we read last cycle, which we just completed reading last Tuesday, I think in many ways is connected or relevant to this article as well, because one book was about Muthulakshmi Reddy and a biography of Muthulakshmi Reddy by Dr. V.R. Devika, and the other one was the biography of Bangalore Nagaratnamar by V. Sriram. So just in that context, I mean, I just wanted to pick out two things that connected back to the readings over there. One is, while I found the novel itself, the Dasikal Mosavale, very, very fascinating for the reasons Lakshmi just summarized, is the ability of this author to sort of present different voices just as they are, right? And bring the story from all of those different perspectives was very, very interesting. But at the same time, there seems to be a blanket absence of anybody or any character who may represent some kind of pride in the art and cultural sense. So that seemed a bit of, I wondered why, because this whole biography we read about Bangalore Nagaratnamar, for instance, repeatedly talks about, what a proud woman she was. First, yes, I mean, regarding her community, yes, but also how artistically proud these women, or at least she was, let's not, generalize it all. And that's definitely also the stories one has read about, for instance, the family of Veenadhanammal, that lineage as well. So I found that the absence of any, character or voice representing that a bit striking. And I wondered why. Was it because it was such a small fraction that it was ignored? What was the reason? So that was definitely something that struck me as I read this. While I think it was also, like, for me, the most interesting thing here is it sort of crystallized that discussion of what was the purpose and who was debating for on behalf of whom, right? Which were also questions that were raised when we were talking about these two factions, the Devadasis and those fighting for the abolishment. So I think it provided a very new perspective for me. The one other thing was a mention on in section 3, when it talks, this article, when it talks about the Ramamritam Ammaya, she says she was born into the Isaivallalar caste in 1883, right? There's a mention of that in section 3. I remember, and maybe Lakshmi, those of us who've read the book can correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Devika's book specifically mentioned something like Ramamrita Mammal was the person who was responsible for renaming the caste, or kind of providing a new nomenclature to the caste as Isaivallalar in order to distance it from the stigma. So there's definitely seems to be some kind of factual friction between that. So, but I just thought I'll start off with that. Like, that was just directly comparing it to what we've read in recent times. Any thoughts, takeaways, things that struck you, or questions which will move the discussion along?
I have a point. More so, it was hard hitting for me when I read the article. There is a point where they say that Satyamurthy as well as Muthulakshmi Reddy, when they speak about Devadasis for and against abolition of the Devadasi system, they both kind of did not consider the voice of Devadasis. So there is one line that says, Muthulakshmi Reddy preferred suppression of their voice instead of, having a meeting or having a dialogue with the Devadasis. So I have not read the book yet, the Muthulakshmi Reddy book, but the initial few pages that I started with, she is her mother is a Devadasi, right? If I'm not wrong, her mother is a Devadasi. So so she coming from the caste, from the same caste, and she saying that okay, their voice is not, uh, and she not considering their inputs or their voice. Uh, it shows for me what was the state of her uh, in that moment when she says that okay, uh, whatever they say is irrelevant at this point. So how much as a medical officer or as a medical practitioner, how much would she have gone through, and how much she would have seen at that point to make such a statement, and then truly believe that okay, it has to be abolished, it has to be whatever they say, it will be in their self-interest rather than anything to the community. So that point itself was a little hard hitting when I read it, and I was like,
Yeah, Padmashi, just to kind of give you a perspective, definitely the narratives in that sense in the book definitely matches, right? I think the book also definitely mentions that she did not consider going to the table with those who, from within the community, who were fighting against the abolishment. So it definitely says that as well. And one of the perspectives that we got from the author last week was that somewhere her mission was so deeply connected with sort of distancing these women from the stigma and the the hard life sort of that came with it, that she was willing to throw under the bus a lot of other things, right? So it was more like all or nothing kind of a fight at that point that she was fighting, because that was one of the questions we asked, saying why, right? A woman like her, why was she not willing to hear the other perspective and acknowledge that another perspective exists? I think what she had definitely seen that had deeply impacted her is the women who earlier on in her life, women who either died of childbirth, right, or who had medical complications for sure, and those who were from the Devdasi community and who were very young and having children. And as a medical professional, she was of course attending to these girls, and there were a lot of girls who were running away from the system, who sought refuge at her gate by this point of time, because she was a very well-established, well-known personality fighting, for their cause. So I think that was the side of the picture that she has, always sort of drove her towards, what she was fighting for. But it definitely became like an all or nothing fight, and the book for sure corroborates that she did not, see, somewhere perhaps thought that it would weaken the argument, right, to be able to go and consider other causes. But that's like a very interesting, we all noted that as quite a, how do you say, a contradiction in her personality, because she's that, and like Lakshmi summarized, I mean, her own marriage was extremely equal. The way she looked at, the life of women on one side was very, very different. But when it came to certain other things, she was quite autocratic also in terms of how she forged ahead with her cause, right, which was ultimately a larger cause that she was fighting. Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
So I think adding on to what you said, that like it didn't have voices of people who did really like who enjoyed the art as art. And also I felt like when she's talking about how the voices of the Devadasis were not heard, but in the same thing she also writes where she barges in and stops the marriages and all of that. So then isn't that contradicting as well, was my thought. Like it, I don't I feel like by reading I can't judge what is right and what is wrong. But there are both sides, right? So which should be respected maybe. So it's also I think it's a never ending debate where you feel like, yeah, people when they are in that situation, you might not know, somebody has to tell them and get them out maybe, so that they understand that they're suppressed and all of that as well. But then they're still not heard again, was the doubt that I had. The community as a whole, like not everybody, just not the Dasis, but in everyone in the community.
Yeah, absolutely fair point there. I wonder though whether I also didn't exactly understand that the particular thing that you're referring to. I did understand what it meant by barging into these weddings. So I also wondered as to what did that mean. But if it was a reference, because if it was a reference to the Devadasis being dedicated, that happened very differently. But then there's definitely a case there to be spoken about, because they were always minors, right? And that's probably the the argument there. But I honestly didn't understand what she was doing, barging into weddings. I didn't get that.
I thought it was the ritual that they do for Devadasi system when they enter the child into a Devadasi system. They do a ritual, right? So, which is kind of a marriage. So I thought she was barging into that and stopping it. But I know.
Yeah, if that's the case, then it makes a little bit more sense.
I thought that was interesting as well, because she seemed to, in the paper, mention two different scenarios for the marriage. One was when she says people, upper caste people got married, they hired these women to come and perform, and she was trying to stop this. She was also trying to get, in the second references to marriage, was also trying to get women from this community who had been dedicated to marry. And this likely caused a lot of friction because they were not technically allowed to do this. I think she was alternatively referring to marriage in both these references in the paper.
Yeah, I too thought like that. She was against these Devadasis going and performing the actual marriage, and also I she had mentioned there are two rituals. One is when the kid is really young, and once they puberty. After the puberty, there is another ritual which is equivalent to the actual marriage. I think she was against going and stopping that marriage as well. And while reading this paper, especially, I felt okay. Couple of questions. One is the whole paper felt as though it is just the transaction. There is no one enjoying the art, or no one is there for the sake of the art, or art is not giving anything in return. It felt like that. It's like, okay, if you have money, okay, you can come and be my partner. Okay, if you are beautiful, okay, you are my partner. It felt as though it's just a very transactional scenario for me, at least.
Yeah, definitely. That's the impression most of the characters uh, present in the book. One of the new learnings for me from this was because at times, I have also spoken about sort of, or understood it as these women having more agency, actually women from this community having more agency than the women who were domestic, housewives kind of a thing. But this, I think, couple of things, right? There were mentions about the uh, who were the partners who were allowed and disallowed, right? So that was sort of new information for me in terms of giving clarity on this is what they were allowed to or not allowed to have. So for the first time, I think, and also in progression with these other readings, it sort of becomes more clear that somehow it seemed to be the bastion of upper caste men, right, to maintain these Devadasi women. So that sort of takes away a little bit of their, I mean, this idea of agency doesn't come into play if that has been the scenario, because it's still restricted playing field. Maybe they said yes or no, but it's not like you fell in love with anybody and then you chose them as your partner in a way. So that was definitely for me new information to consider in terms of, like, I guess how I think about uh, their lives, right, as something that's more freeing and having choice, or having their hands tied in some sense. Yeah.
I have a maybe. Um, I think eventually maybe it turned out, because even I've heard a lot of, like, I've read a lot about what you said, no, that they had the freedom and all of that. So maybe eventually, uh, when maybe the influence of the British, or I don't know, like maybe at that time is when it became like this. Do you think that's a possibility, where it was more restricted, or maybe it was from the beginning, or also it could be based on different regions? Obviously, rules change.
Yeah, that's very possible. I think we can definitely take that as a thing, where we can go hunt for references that mention that. I haven't read anything to the effect. I don't know if anyone else in the room has. But yeah, that's something that we can go and find out, I think. Was that also an evolution, or was that how it stayed for the most part? Yeah.
One of the papers that I came across. I've placed it in the chat. So it's basically a critique against this paper, saying it represents the story that she creates. It doesn't represent the Devadasis as a whole, but instead provides Muvulu Ramamritam's perspective or take within this. So yes, it goes further than perhaps other accounts in this period did. She considers them as individuals within their socio-political context, but she considers their motivations purely transactional. And I think that paper pushes against this, and she referenced to previous work, but both within, by women within this tradition. So there's references to Muttupalani and her writing. There's also references in this paper to Kshetraya and to songs that the Devdasi women likely wrote and performed to. And she tries to push back against the same, against the amount of agency perhaps that she reflects. So I thought that was interesting.
And I suppose that's always the case, right? Because anything that's presented, as one extreme and having just one kind of, just unhappiness or happiness, like either of the stories I feel are extremes. Like even a Bangalore Nagaratnam story, which is completely fair from a biographical point of view, but may not necessarily be a representation of the life that all Devadasis led. What could be interesting, I'm thinking, is there are mentions within here and several references about these meetings of the Devadasis, them trying to find a representation at the Congress meetings, whatever representations that they were writing, etc. But try and, I don't know if there's any perspective we can get, I'm sure there will be something to find more, like who were these people, right? Who were the women in these in the association, right? Was it few voices? Was it many voices? And what were the real narratives that they were building? I don't know if that's even, or what were their real reasons? Let's put it that way. That goes beyond the rhetoric, which of course this article mentions, and it's true about that one representation that that we've read in the Devesh Someji book, right, where it comes back to arguments of defending in some way their virtue and honor and chastity and speaking the same language of the opponent, unfortunately. And in those papers, I just want to see if there is more language of the nature of, like Bangalore Nagaratnam, the kind of personality that she was, who took great pride in where she stood and the women that had come before her. So were they making this case? How motivated were they to make this case? Things like that would be interesting to find, I suppose.
Akka, I also thought that it is like just how we feel of a law, like where we belong in the how it affects us. The same way, the same situation affected these people too. I don't think so there is a right or a wrong answer here. The scenario where they are and how it is affecting them as such, that's what they thought about it. And that's how they reacted to the situation of a Devadasi law, maybe.
That's right. Yes.
So, I had a few questions that don't really relate very directly with the content of the paper. They were more speculative in nature, and they were just more along the what ifs kind of line of thought. But I keep looking at several instances in the paper that talk about zamindari and talk about like a certain kind of financial privilege that these men who were often either like associated with the Devdasis or like the community would sort of lean towards siding with them or being associated with them. I often wonder how much of it was just pure financial power, because at the end of the day, like if you think about when colonialism happened and when the imperial rule set in, and I think the first very direct and obvious um, fallback or like fallout of it was because they essentially axed the whole royal households and the patronages, and I think that was a direct hit that the Devadasi community took, right? Because essentially pre-colonialism they were in the patronage or under the patronage of these royal households. And so I begin to think how much of um, their slightly darker ages can be attributed to that. And the next question would be, would it have made a difference had it had the focus been more on the art and the kind of cultural repositories that they were, like you said, like would they have found maybe a different kind of future had they solely, I mean, for the lack of a better term, marketed their talents in the way that many of us as professionals today do. Like, we are teachers, we are researchers, and like they had so much, like basically the tradition more or less started with them, right? So could it have turned out differently had they sort of monetized it and like taken pride in their art and been more vocal about it? And would there have been any kind of agencies that could have supported that kind of I don't know, like rolling out of their artistic capabilities? Like just some thoughts.
Yeah, Rupa. Um, I think with the latter, I suppose it's also a question that we are posing very much from the vantage point that we are in, right? I mean, the understanding of what marketing your art even means, right? From many points of view, I think they were doing that very effectively, because you appeal to whether it was a royal patron or a zamindar patron, you appealed to those pockets where there was a certain whatever rasika, like there is appreciation for this art, and then there is the ability to monetarily compensate well enough, right? And those were their markets, if anything else. I mean, I suppose that the courts and the zamindar households were the markets that where they uh, yeah, the shift into, I mean, perhaps one of the things is that very accelerated shift away from their traditional spaces into newer spaces, which the question simply was how many or what fraction of the community was able to keep up with that shift, right? Because I can just remember two instances from Bangalore Nagaratnama's life where they speak about her sort of starting to record gramophone records, right? And it's something that there was a lot of hesitation towards, a lot of what's going to happen with this, how is this going to work. But she was one of the first few from the south of India to really go into that space without being skeptical and all that, and again kind of make a mark even over there. So question is, that shift, how did it happen? Is there a larger study to see were more people trying to make that shift as it existed? The other thing which was very interesting to me is it also mentions in a point in her biography that she made a very specific decision to stop dancing and to continue to sing, because she saw and sensed the direction in which the field was moving forward, and somehow the stigma sort of stuck very clearly to the dancers, right? While Devadasis were not meant to be only dancers, they were dancers, musicians, like artists in their own right. So she made a very strategic decision to stop dancing and to continue forward only with singing, which contributed to the image she held on to until her last years as well. So yeah, that wasn't to answer your question at all, but I'm just trying to understand what sense does that question make, because if we're posing it through the lens of where we stand, how do we navigate that question here? right? Of,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
I think it was just me wondering whether it would have had a completely different outcome had they been more financially empowered in a way that, like you said, that would have enabled, supported, or basically like nourished that shift of like from going from like one space socially to another. And whether, had they had the resources, would they have taken different decisions? Like that was just something that was playing on my mind.
One thing that just comes to my mind also is, if this is not out of any written reference, so I mean, I say it completely with that knowledge that it is more what I've heard, is in a way the shift now has happened not just in terms of the markets shifting, right? Like, you're not just going from the King's Courts to maybe a public stage, but you're a much more serious shift started to happen in terms of the purpose of what they did, right? And I think that's a larger and a more tragic thing to deal with, especially when it's thrown at you within a few decades, right? Because if I don't have an understanding of my art, because that's not the way I've been, what I have seen in my life, from a point of view of ritual, from a point of view of, representing good omen. Because this is one thing that's definitely, I think it's there are mentions here, and like we said, why did Devadasis come and dance or, sing or perform at your functions? Because it was considered auspicious, right? That, for me, I'm very far away from that, trying to understand how would I negotiate with my art if I thought that was the value and that was the purpose of my art. And if you then take that, like if I just think of a reverse shift, I'm just thinking of it, right? Hypothetically, if suddenly someone were to tell me, like, the only place you can perform henceforth is the temple, or is at a marriage to bring auspiciousness, what would I do? Right? How would I deal with that change? Because I'm very, like, it's like you're taking away purpose in the way I understand it. Even though I may, cerebrally know how to shift and market myself in that new market, but would I care to do it if you take away purpose? I just wonder.
Yeah, to add to Akka's points, in one of the during pandemic, I watched way too many docu-series. So many are there in YouTube too. And in one of the, I think it is Odisha Devadasi, if I remember it correctly. Suddenly it is all gone, and the next day law is passed, and the next day her granny was there crying. It seems she's like, my god, is whether he will be eating, whether he will be sleeping. So they were in that mindset. If I don't go and perform, he will not be eating. If I don't go and perform, he will not be sleeping. How he will be, what state he will be in. So I think we are not in that space to think.
I think that also just brings me to a perhaps an important connection we should make, right? Is also the timeline itself of Ramamritam Amar, right? Born in the late 1800s. So it's the same thing. It's probably her entire life, like her novel represents the voices, the kind of voices that she was actually in fact seeing and experiencing around her. Because, it's probably a telling case that by this point of time, the significance of those ritual dasis, or, people who were inseparable from the temple, or was, I don't know, maybe the significance of that had also dropped quite a bit already at, in this timeline, and hence the voices that she's representing.
I think continuing from there, I remember once I heard Raghuram sir say that, like when the Dasis dance, generally not everybody was not allowed into the temple. Like when you're talking about the timeline, in that sense, I'm saying, so they would show what's happening inside, like the Shardopajara or something with the hands, and so people could see what's happening, right? And then in the article, I'm not sure where exactly, but it mentions where something like, what's the purpose of music? It's just to advertise the Dasi system. So you can see the shift of how the purpose of what they were doing changed to now, why are we dancing? Like how you said. So that thing is there as well. And also, when you said art, I think they did somewhere try to bring out the art perspective of it, because I think that's why they changed the name to like Isai Velalar or Kalavanthulu or any that in that they're specifying art as a whole, like just art. So instead of servants of the god, they changed it to music and dance, terms that represented that. So maybe maybe they did try, but it didn't become a huge thing.
And also last week, the author herself, she mentioned that the purpose of transformation, or what the Muthulakshmi wanted, is just the abolition of the bondage between the temple. And she wanted to have those properties to the Devadasis itself, so that they can do something with their lives. It is unfortunate that how the law has passed is totally different. It is not the purpose of Muthulakshmi, is what she said. She was against the bondage. Like you are, if you are in the book, they mention that they do have a ritual of putting this mark on your arm, saying that okay, you belong to this zamindar, or you this king, or you belong to this temple. That bondage is not, she was not against the art per se, but she was against this bondage which comes with the art. That is what yeah, she mentioned.
That is true, but I think like we said earlier, it seems like she also made a deliberate choice to keep that as her, like because she felt it was a larger purpose that she was fighting for, and that just had to be in focus, and any other interference with that larger cause was a problem in her view. The book, I remember, mentioned something about how she did in fact make some compromises with the law, right? From the bill, the way it was introduced by her, in the form that it was introduced, and many compromises were made by the end, when it came out as law. But she was willing to make those compromises, which I think included, if I'm not wrong, she was asking for criminalizing it from all perspectives. That is, it would be the Devadasi who's involved herself, and the people who were involved in the dedication or the patronage. And that's what she was fighting for. That every one party to it, right, would be it would be considered a criminal offense. But I think the act did not finally have that. It was the Devadasis who would have paid the price, right, for being dedicated, versus the temple structure or the patronage or whatever the other structures that were concerned. So there were some, it seems like some concessions that were made to accommodate for what seemed like that singular purpose of course, preventing the dedication itself. If you remember, Dr. Deepika also said something last time, which was that the act, apparently, the final act, right, that was passed in 1947, not just states that the abolishment dedication is now criminal, right? Will be considered a criminal act, or an illegal act rather, but it also made it illegal for any dedicated Devadasi to perform anywhere. Something to that effect. I don't know. I'm just sort of
Yeah,
what
I
she
do
said.
remember like that, but she was telling it, the Muthulakshmi was not going for it. It is in the end, that is how it came out. But she was not against the art per se. That is how before reading the book, that is how it was in my head, especially for that matter. I was just wondering, okay, why she was against this art per se. But later realized, as I went through the book, I realized that okay, she, as a gynecologist, as a she has seen a lot the cases and other stuff, and also as she is coming from the Devadasi family, inside the family she has seen a lot, and in the professional front also she has seen a lot. I think because of that she was against this bondage and other stuff, uh, and she wasn't against the art. That is what I took away from the session, from the Dr. Devika session actually.
Fair enough. I mean, unless we have an account from her, we will not know what she thought about the art, which I'm sure there is an autobiography, right, of Muthu Lakshmi Reddy. I haven't read that. Lakshmi, have you read the autobiography, or have you?
I haven't read the complete book, but I've read secondary literature that discusses it.
Okay.
Her primary concern, I think, in the lens through which she sees the Devadasis itself, is she sees their art as tied in with their non-conjugal sexuality. So I don't think she separates that at all. So all her remarks towards this community is about the perhaps the other side of its practice and why she wants to eradicate it. So there's very little that she actually speaks about in her art. I was also just thinking, going back to your question, Durgan, whether they could have marketed themselves differently, and the role that ritual played within temples. I remember reading like references to them dancing, perhaps Kuravanjis on, for instance, the Sarafoji, the second in Tanjavur. They danced, for instance, to God Save the Queen during the imperial period to notice Swarams, marching British marching bands. So I mean, it doesn't seem like their role was entirely limited or done particularly with view of a certain ritual temple tradition. It seemed very flexible, very, I don't know if we would say the purpose of dancing was entirely different from our own, or that they didn't in some way embody this, didn't dance for performance itself, it seemed. So maybe if they had that socioeconomic opportunity at that time, maybe that would have looked different. Where it had gone.
Yeah, and there are, in fact, those accounts also about the first Devdasis who traveled abroad, right? And the tour of Europe and things like that. And that time frame is quite early, isn't it, Lakshmi? Like, what do you remember? What was the time?
I think it was either the late 19th century.
Yeah. Would they actually travel as a troupe abroad and, present, of course, themes that are of interest to Europeans, which is the exotic East of some sort? But yeah, that's fair. They seem like, I think what begs the question here is only that there are clearly these different layers within the community that exist, and which is strong enough to drive people, right, from within or without, because they are seeing a certain reality which is hitting them very strong. And what was the coexistence of these realities is, I think, the one big piece of the puzzle that's missing right now, right? Because everyone clearly saw something that was very imposing to them, like like something that needed addressing. But yeah, where can we find the accounts where, like an insider's view where these different factions coexist, or these different possibilities coexist as well?
That was also the other question I had. Like, when you come across the term Devadasi system, you're not really sure everything that, like, about everything that the word system entails, right? Like, what constitutes the system? How was it looked at from like different angles? Like, because obviously people outside of it and people in administrative or like um supervisory kind of positions, no, whether it's in the government or whether it's in society, were obviously looking at it through a certain lens, like I said. And then within the community, and like Nidhi said, within the family, it meant something entirely different, right? And then I think as we evolved as a society, the changing tensions between like these varying views also contributed to a lot of confusion amongst the uninitiated who did not fall in either of these categories, right? Like maybe somebody who was just like your average man and woman in society probably didn't have any clue about what either of the sides were saying. And then how much of this confusion has percolated into the accounts that we hear today, right? Because like not obviously everything that we've read has come from one or the other. It's always been a derivative of what has been heard, what they've seen around them, and that can be so rife with so many misunderstandings, right?
Yeah, and I think that it's sort of also like um, like a reminder in so many ways to keep our minds open to, because there's a very intrinsic, I don't know whether I should call it a need, but tendency to homogenize, right? Everything, our narratives, our what we the way we look at history, like somehow we need to be in one zone or another. But I think, yeah, it's also like a reminder that whatever one consumes or reads, to always remember that it is one thread of the narrative, all like for sure, right? Without even having heard the other narratives, to be aware that there will be layers and there will be other stories there. Any other thoughts? Maybe since we're at the 1 hour mark, we can just like wind down with closing thoughts on the article, some idea that perhaps stuck with you, or something that you take away, just if there's anything around the room.
My thoughts, in terms of what you just said, Apurvaka, is there's just so much to process, because I feel like, especially after reading this article, everything has become really gray in a way. Like I feel like, especially like I used to have a very black and white understanding of like this was the Devadasi situation, but now hearing so many different perspectives, I'm like confused, but in a really nice way, knowing that there's so many threads to sort of like look at, and it will constantly keep changing. I feel like if I read another article, like even having read like Muthulakshmi Reddy's book, I felt like I was sort of tilting towards like, oh, very much empathizing with where she came from. Like, yeah, that made a lot of sense. But then being thrown this article and realizing that she was actually representing their voice without giving them a voice, like hearing it in that perspective, I was like, oh, maybe I was going a bit too far on this end. So it was like, it's constantly, like every time I read more and more, I'm constantly like, my perspective on the whole thing is changing in a really nice way though.
Yeah, definitely the same. That's my state of mind. Absolutely mirrored it. Anyone else with closing thoughts or takeaways?
Hi there. I would love to share a few ideas. It was really nice to hear everyone's thoughts, and I just wanted to kind of pick up on a couple of ideas from my own research work. I did a research master's essentially on all of this, so I found this quite interesting. And the first thing I just wanted to share was actually going back to the very beginning when we talked about the term Isai and how Ramamirta kind of is said to have come up with the term, but actually there's also a differing view in Devesh Sonerji's Unfinished Gestures, and he kind of claims, based on his own research, that it was actually the men from the community who were trying to distance themselves from that. And so I found that quite interesting, how there's differing ideas in the way the term came up as well. So that's one thought. And the other thought I had was going back to the point about gray areas, which I find really interesting. And it's this idea that the Devadasi system, whatever the term system means, was it was a societal structure that dates back to thousands of years ago, and it was perhaps a societal structure that is not present in today's society, and perhaps even less during the time when Victorian morality also influenced a lot of morality within India at the time. And so yes, this idea that it's either they were either nuns or they kind of more or less women, it's a very binary and kind of dual viewing of it, and I find that really interesting. And I think the gray area is I think where we really should be kind of looking into. So yeah, really appreciated everyone's thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Martina. Would you mind telling us a bit about what your own research is about? That would be interesting.
Sure. So I completed an MPhil at the University of Cambridge in Modern South Asian Studies, and I chose my research project to focus on Bharatanatyam as essentially international cultural capital. So I started learning Bharatanatyam about 10, 11 years back, and very often it kind of was drawing from my own experience. Whenever I'm on the stage, the first question I'm asked, "Oh, but why do you do Bharatanatyam?" But then my kind of idea stemmed from the fact that if you see, for example, I don't know, like a Chinese ballet dancer, you wouldn't think, oh, but why is that person doing ballet? It's just, they appreciated the art form and therefore they decided to learn it. So why can't Bharatanatyam be the same? So that's kind of where I kind of started from, and I started looking at what makes cultural capital, what makes international cultural capital, and why should we consider an art form, especially an art form that is so steeped in culture like Bharatanatyam is, and to an extent, some people call it religious. Why should it be open? Should it be open? Should it not? So those thoughts kind of made up my research project.
Fascinating. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. I hope we'll it would be nice to read some of your papers.
Oh yes, I'd love to share. Thank you so much.
Yes, please. No, we'd love to do that. We'll definitely circle back and do that at some point.
Thank you.
Anything else? Anyone else for last thoughts? All right. I think that's a great note to end this session on. Thanks everyone for joining us. We're beginning to really look forward to these Tuesday evenings. It's always so enriching and so stimulating, and I find it very hard to go to sleep on a Tuesday night because I have a lot running in my head afterwards. If any of you are so interested, next week we're going to start with our next book reading cycle. So that's definitely something that will be a 7 to 8 week cycle. We've decided to pick again 2 books in parallel this time. One is going to be Nitya Sumangali by Saskia, and the other one is Wives of the God King by, sorry, I cannot say the author's name, Frederick, do not pronounce this properly, I know, but 2 books in parallel. We'll be sending out the details for very soon on the mailing list. So yes, please join us if you're interested to continue with that journey. Thank you. Thanks so much. Lovely seeing you.
Thank you.